Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask our guests here in-house if you'll be so kind to check cell phones to see that they have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, for our Internet viewers, you're welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at any time to speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Ambassador Terry Miller. Ambassador Miller is the Mark A. Kolokotronis Fellow in Economic Freedom. He is also director of our Center for Data Analysis and Center for Trade and Economics. He directs our ongoing research in the role of free markets and trade in fostering economic growth here and around the world. He oversees Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom publication that is a co-published booklet with the Wall Street Journal. Prior to joining us here, Ambassador Miller was a diplomat in public service. In 2006, he was appointed by President Bush as an ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. Before that, he served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Global Issues, as well as several overseas appointments. Please join me in welcoming Terry Miller. Terry?
Thank you, John, and let me add my welcome to you all to the Heritage Foundation today. There's a lot going on in the trade world here in Washington right now. There's a lot of heat being generated on all sides of the debate about trade promotion authority, people trying to look ahead to the possibility of an agreement on a Trans-Pacific partnership, and even further into the future, perhaps a trade partnership with the European Union. We're not really here to talk about the specifics of those, though as usual in the question period, you're invited to bring up any issue that's of interest to you. These debates that are going on right now are very frustrating, I think, for people who are true believers in free trade, because a lot of the heat that's being generated are about issues that really have very little to do with trade liberalization. There are a lot of charges and countercharges about what happens when trade agreements, what happens as a result of trade agreements. And the part that's the most frustrating for me personally is that all of the debate, virtually all of the debate in this area tends to be about promotion of exports. That's what we have heard from the administration from day one, that their policies in terms of trade are going to be all about building up exports for Americans. But of course, what economists know, and many Americans know in their bones, I think, is that the most benefits from trade come on the other side of the equation. They come from the imports that we enjoy. Milton Friedman was known for his quote that exports are the price we pay for the benefit of imports. So that's what perhaps the greatest conservative economists thought about this question. And even when you look at the data from the administration, there's a new report out last week from the Council of Economic Advisors that had a lot of talk about exports, as you would expect, but also a little bit about imports in it. And a couple of statistics jumped out from that report for me. One was that the gains from trade on the import side, the average American family household was gains $13,600 a year in purchasing power because of the imports that we enjoy from trade flows. That's $1.3 trillion annually for the economy as a whole, and a huge boost to personal incomes. And on the distributional side, where does that benefit go for the most part? Well, there's another statistic in the Council of Economic Advisors report, that shows the gains from trade across the income distribution. People in the top 10% of the income distribution have their purchasing power increased by 3% because of those gains from trade. That's not very much. For the middle class, the vast middle of the income distribution, the gains from trade. On the import side, the income gains from imports 29% higher purchasing power because of imports. And for people in the bottom 10%, the people that we, in terms of public policy, often worry about the most and perhaps should worry about the most, they gain 62% of their purchasing power from the fact that they can import freely from other countries around the world. So we're here today to elaborate on this theme of the benefits of imports, not exports. And we brought together a rather distinguished panel of thinkers on this issue. Dan Eichenson is the director of Cato's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, where he coordinates and conducts research on all manners of international trade and investment policy. Since joining Cato in 2000, Dan has authored dozens of papers on various aspects of trade policy, and he focuses his research on U.S.-China trade relations, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, globalization, U.S. manufacturing, trade policies, trade remedies, things like the anti-dumping regime. Dan's one of the best and most prolific free market, free trade-oriented writers in Washington at this time. Brian Riley is Heritage Foundation's J. Van Andel Senior Analyst in Trade Policy. He works in Heritage's Center for Trade and Economic Policy. Brian contributes to the influential Index of Economic Freedom, which Heritage publishes annually in partnership with the Wall Street Journal. He got his start working on trade policy in the 1990s during debates on NAFTA and the Uruguay round, and he helped defeat efforts to subject minivans and SUVs to tariffs as high as 25%. Derek Scissors is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Asian economic issues and trends. In particular, he focuses on the Chinese and Indian economies and U.S. economic relations with China and India. He's author of the China Global Investment Tracker, and he's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University, where he teaches a course on the Chinese economy. Before joining AEI, Derek was a senior research fellow right here at Heritage in the Asian Studies Center. He's also worked in London for the Intelligence Research Limited, taught economics at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and served as an action officer in international economics and energy for the U.S. Department of Defense. So we're going to start this with Dan Eichenson.
Excellent. Should I sit here?
It's totally up to you.
Okay.
So you've got the computer.
Yeah, I'll stay
there.
here. I have this here, and I've got a few slides that I'm going to show you, but thank you all for coming. Thanks for the introduction, Terry, and thanks for inviting me, Brian. How many of you all know that it's the 4th annual Imports Week? A few of you know. That's good. Yeah, so we have to designate a special week each year for people in Washington and around the country to think about imports. You know, the other 51 weeks of the year, you know, it's a dirty word. So I'm glad you're here to join us. My colleagues at Cato often joust me with me and say, you know, haven't we won the debate already? Didn't Adam Smith win the debate in 1776 about free trade? And in fact, we saw that sort of reflected in a Mankiw op-ed a couple of weeks ago, which got a lot of pushback. And my point is that he may have laid the groundwork. He may have demonstrated that the point of trade is to specialize, and through specialization and trade, we can consume more. But the mercantilists that he allegedly vanquished still dominate the narrative in Washington and Brussels and Tokyo and around the world. So there is this view that exports are Team America's points. You know, when you go to buy things, when you buy products and services, you want to part with as few dollars as possible. You want to get value. And, you know, as Smith said, what is prudence in the conduct of every private family surely can't be folly in the service of a kingdom, or something to that effect. That applies here, but we seem to lose sight of that. It becomes Team America against the rest of the world. Exports are our points. Imports are the foreign team's points. The trade account is the scoreboard. We have a deficit. The deficit means we're losing at trade, and often we're losing because the foreign team is cheating. So that's basically the narrative. I think it's wrong. There's a lot to benefit. There are a lot of reasons to embrace imports. And in fact, the policies of governments seem to acknowledge the benefits of imports. You'll never hear candidates or policymakers talking about, this agreement is necessary because it's going to open up the U.S. clothing market, or it's going to open up the auto market. It's all about the export side. I don't know if you recall, in 2002, there was a proposal in the Doha round to achieve zero tariffs in industrial goods by 2015. And then USTR Robert Zellick at the time said, this is great, it's going to turn every corner street in America, every corner store in America into a duty-free shop. That was the first time I'd heard somebody at the administrative level really put that stamp on it. But sure enough, he was reined in, and we didn't hear that very often again, and we still don't hear that kind of, it's not tested, it doesn't really work up here on the Hill. We also see it in tariff policies. We had this great recession. There was a lot of concern about tit-for-tat protectionism arising. For the most part, it didn't. I mean, there was some protectionism, but governments had incentive and were being pushed by domestic interests to remain open to imports because of globalization. Because every country now has interests that are highly dependent on imports. In the United States, 60% of the value of our imports is capital equipment, intermediate goods, raw materials, things like that. So we need to be open. Our policy reflects it. Another place to look is the WTO's, the tariff rates that are applied, the MFN tariff rates. We have bound rates and applied rates. And if imports were really the scourge that policymakers and negotiators make them out to be, we would expect to see the applied rates up at the bound rates. But in fact, bound rates are up here. For India, on average, for industrial goods, I think it's like 51%, but the applied rates are down here at like 12%. And that's the case around the globe. So governments know that it's important to be open. We also saw Canada and Mexico at that stage decide to, when all the G20 countries were reassuring one another that we wouldn't engage in protectionism, Canada and Mexico scrapped lots of industrial tariffs, lots of tariffs on intermediate goods, because they recognized as the global economy was contracting and revenues for their exporters were going to contract, they wanted to reduce the costs of production for their producers. And by slashing import tariffs, that's one way to do that. So it's obvious that import tariffs are cost of production, and they cost U.S. jobs. I wanted to show you a few slides.
Finally, I was wondering what that has to do with international trade.
The reason that Adam Smith hasn't vanquished the mercantilists is because somebody's drilling on the second floor.
Let me jump in here just to apologize. We have a major construction project going out behind the building, and sometimes we get these strange noises like that. It's nothing to be concerned about, but I do apologize for the interruption.
It's the imported drill bits, I'm sure. But the reason he hasn't vanquished the mercantilists, the reason the narrative is dominated by mercantilism is because of these myths. I mean, they're myths that are perpetuated by K Street, but on the business side, on the labor side, on the pro-trade, the anti-trade side, and that's, this is a myth, a widely held but false belief or idea. Remember, at one point, humans thought the Earth was at the center of our solar system. We also believed, we also believed that the Earth was flat. Those are myths. And then Robert Scott of the Economic Policy Institute likes to say, while increased exports can support increases in domestic employment, growing imports cost U.S. jobs. That's demonstrably false. I'll show you a couple of other slides to back myself up. And then there's Bernie Sanders. I put him in there just because he's fairly topical at the moment, but it's a similar derivative of the same idea. So I have this presentation that I've been giving at universities around the country from time to time, trying to dispel these common trade myths. So I pulled some of these slides from that, but they're related to this aversion to imports. Trade is a competition between us and them. The trade deficit means we're losing a trade, etc. But let me just show you a couple of reasons why the trade deficit doesn't mean we're losing a trade, or why imports are good, actually. So this shows us changes in real imports and real GDP over a 44-year period. And if imports detracted from GDP, we would see an inverse relationship. We would expect to see these years, those red squares, in the upper left and lower right quadrants. Only one of them is in the upper left quadrant. The rest of them are all in the upper right and lower left, which means that as imports increase, GDP increases, and vice versa. That's, of course, when the economy is expanding, we import more. Business imports more, consumers import more. Here's to get to Robert Scott's point. Similar situation with real imports and jobs. There are a few more instances in which there's an inverse relationship, but by and large, there's a positive relationship. We are increasing jobs as the economy expands. So this notion that exports create jobs and imports take them away is demonstrably false. There are lots of other slides and data that I could show you at another point. And this is another point I just want to make. Members of the media and most people are seduced by this national income identity. Right? This tells us what we do with our output. Our output is either consumed by private individuals, by business, by government. It's exported. And then we subtract imports. Why do we subtract imports to measure our total output? Well, everybody says, well, there's an inverse relationship between imports and output. But the reason we subtract M is because M is embedded in C, I, G, and X. We consume domestic and imported materials. Business consumes through I, imported and domestic. Government, imported and domestic. And what we export contains domestically or imported materials. That's why we subtract M. So I wish members of the media understood that a little bit better. Finally, these are price changes over a 7-year period. These are products that are prone to trade, that are traded frequently. That are not traded frequently, and you see that the prices have increased quite dramatically. These are products that we see lots of trade in, and that's what's happened to their prices. So the more you trade, the larger the market, the more you can specialize, the greater the scope for economies of scale and competition and price declines. You guys know what car that is? The AMC Pacer, yeah. So that's basically what the big three. That was like what they were offering us in the 70s. The Hornet, the Ford Pinto, which would sort of explode on rear impact. What kicked them in the pants and got them motivated was investment from Japanese, from Honda, from other foreign producers in the United States. That competition is what's good for consumers. Otherwise, we'd be stuck with things like that. And I'll end with this one. These are just a variety of products that we have access to that are enjoyed in the United States, but made by foreign companies in the United States or made abroad that we enjoy. So this idea that only rich corporations benefit from trade really overlooks the fact that, and what Terry alluded to, that lower income Americans really benefit dramatically and disproportionately from trade liberalization because of their access to imports. I think that's it. Those are yours. I'm sorry.
No, go on, because I was going to, thank you.
There
The
you
next
go.
one was going to start talking at us.
Yeah, okay, sorry. All right, thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
As you all know, yesterday was Mother's Day, and to those of you who were lucky enough to receive flowers, or those who were thoughtful enough to send flowers, odds are that the flowers were from Colombia or from Latin America. 75 to 80% of the cut flowers, are imported from other countries. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? Similarly, when we go to the grocery store,
it's an imported computer.
So just hit the, yeah, that should work.
when we go to the grocery store,
You want me to do?
sure, sure.
I've got the magic touch.
Tech support is on the way.
Okay.
Oh, down. Not right, down. Grocery store, anytime during the winter, we have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, not necessarily grown locally, but from all over the world, thousands of miles away. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? When the North American Free Trade Agreement was being debated, one commentator suggested it should be called the North American Cancer Reduction Agreement. because
I didn't touch it.
I know you didn't. That's great. Because we'd have access to healthier food all throughout the year. Terry referred to Milton Friedman earlier, and if this plays, this is a comment that Professor Friedman made in my hometown of Kansas State University, of Manhattan, Kansas, at Kansas State University.
In the international trade area, the language is almost always about how we must export. And what's really good is an industry that produces exports. And if we buy from abroad and import, that's bad. But surely that's just upside down as well. What we send abroad, we can't eat, we can't wear, we can't use for our houses. The goods and services we send abroad are goods and services not available to us. On the other hand, the goods and services we import, they provide us with TV sets we can watch, with automobiles we can drive, with all sorts of nice things for us to use. The gain from foreign trade is what we import. What we export is the cost of getting those imports. And the proper objective for a nation, as Adam Smith put it, is to arrange things so we get as large a volume of imports as possible for as small a volume of exports as possible.
And my colleagues Ryan Olson and Anthony Kim have an issue brief that you may have had a chance to pick up on your way in, or you can get on the way out, which goes into some of those arguments in more detail. But there's a more basic argument, I think, as Americans, when we produce something, whether it's wheat or oil, who should be able to decide what happens to that product? Do you have the ability to sell it to whoever you want to? Or does somebody in Washington, D.C. get to decide, no, you can't sell that product, or we're going to restrict it? And actually, in the U.S. Constitution, Congress can't put taxes on exports, but it can ban exports, and that's to the detriment not just of freedom, but to our economy when we're looking at things like U.S. energy export opportunities. And similarly, when you get your paycheck, who decides how you can spend your dollars? Should it be you, based on what you think is the best use of your dollars? Or should it be somebody in Washington, D.C., based on who has the best and most powerful lobbyists? I think having the freedom to spend your money is best, and certainly our Index of Economic Freedom shows, and the similar publication that Cato and Fraser produce, both show that in countries where there's more economic freedom and lower trade barriers, there's more opportunity and higher standards of living. Dan, you mentioned, I think, that about up to 60% of imports are either intermediate goods, raw materials, or capital goods that are used by U.S. manufacturers to produce other things. And I understand that it's a challenging and complicated debate to talk about the benefits of imports in general. But I'd hope we can agree that imports that are needed by U.S. manufacturers to remain competitive in the global marketplace are something that are valuable, and that reducing barriers to those intermediate goods to help us be more competitive is something that we should embrace. It's good not only because it lowers costs for U.S. companies, but can encourage foreign investment as well, because those imported intermediate goods can come in duty-free. And in recent years, there have been several car companies that have looked at opening new factories in the United States, new factories in Mexico, and there was an Audi factory that was referred to in the Wall Street Journal, and Audi had put not contract, but held land in Tennessee as a possible spot for their factory, and they wound up building in Mexico instead. And they said the reason they did that was because Mexico has lower tariffs on inputs and more trade agreements with other countries, so opportunities to import and export more freely. So that's an example of the type of policy that would be good for the United States. So I don't think you may or may not choose to agree with Milton Friedman or Dan Ikinson or Derek Scissors, but I would hope that most people could agree that we should get rid of barriers that make it harder for U.S. companies and manufacturers to compete. And I think getting rid of tariffs on those intermediate goods, which are very low, they're less than 1% anyway, should be something that would be a positive step in the right direction, and that avoids some of the more controversial, politically charged arguments. I would hope that it'd be easy for a politician who's challenged, well, we can't have more imports because it'll cost jobs. We're just talking in this specific case of imports that will help create jobs and good jobs in the United States. Yeah.
All right, that's a good segue because I'm going to talk about jobs. There are a lot of issues with imports, and my colleagues have touched on some of them. But the political issue is that imports cost jobs, and the trade deficit signifies lost jobs. And I'm going to argue that that's, as Dan suggested, but I'll give more information, that that's demonstrably false. And the way you get those claims is somebody either assuming it's true, which is what the previously mentioned Robert Scott does, or running a simulation, because when he looked at the data don't support the claim. So in the real world, imports do not cost jobs. In the fantasy world that protectionists create, they do, but in the real world, they don't. Let's go for some examples. In 2009, the trade deficit fell $300 billion. Our imports fell almost $600 billion. We created a lot of jobs that year? No. Let me give you a little bit more. Our disposable income hit its peak in May 2008, hit a peak in May 2008. It didn't recover again until May 2011. We get the drop in trade deficit, we get the drop in imports, and our unemployment rate rises from 5% to 9.3%. Labor force participation falls from 66.2% to 64.3%. Why am I using those numbers? That is a case where we got poorer, disposable income fell, imports fell, and our job market weakened. And I'm going to argue that that's exactly what protectionists want to do. They want to make our economy weaker. We import less, and we get fewer jobs. Now you're thinking that's the financial crisis. You can't use that. Okay, fine. The main argument is that the U.S. economy drives trade. Trade doesn't drive the American economy. And the argument that trade drives the American economy is something that doesn't exist in the real world, and people make up because they're trying to make false arguments against trade. Our biggest trade deficit we've ever run is in 2006. Labor force participation at the end of that year is 66.4%. We've never gotten back to that level. Our trade deficit has fallen, and labor force participation has fallen with it. Unemployment at the end of the year where we had our biggest trade deficit is 4.4%. So it's not just the financial crisis. The lowest trade deficit, the best year we had according to protectionists in the last 33 years is 91-92 when the trade deficit was below $40 billion. Unemployment was over 7%. Paul Krugman is doing that, I'm telling you right now. After NAFTA goes into effect, NAFTA is the bane of the protectionist movement. They just hate NAFTA. They're not really arguing about TPP. They're arguing about NAFTA when they make most of their arguments. NAFTA goes into effect in 1994. Unemployment drops progressively into the 4%. The best year we've ever had for labor force participation is 1999, after NAFTA has had its time to fully affect the U.S. economy. At that time, we had what was then a record trade deficit. I can go back further. The result is the same every single time. High imports are correlated with a strong U.S. economy and a strong U.S. job market. Dan showed the general result. I can give you the specific results. The financial crisis, the impact of NAFTA, and so on. Weak U.S. economy means imports drop, which protectionists like, and our job market is terrible. So, why is this? Why do I think protectionists want to make us poor? Because that's the logic of their argument. The logic of their argument is they either want magic to happen, somehow we change the terms of trade, or they want a government action which is going to raise the cost to consumers. They want to tax imports, they want to inhibit them in some way. Whatever they want to do is going to make us poorer. So the financial crisis is not a fake example that's unfair to protectionists. That's what they want to do. It's right now you can freely buy imports, as Brian was referring to. They want to make that harder, which essentially makes you poor. And we see what happens when Americans get poorer. They buy fewer imports, the protectionists get what they want, and the job market gets weaker. And why does that happen? We know why it happens. First of all, if you make, let's just pick televisions because we import most of our televisions. If you make televisions more expensive, you might say, well, we can make televisions more expensive, and then we'll make them here, and then we'll have jobs here. Effect number one, though, is you've made televisions more expensive so people don't buy as many. So what happens is those jobs don't come back to the United States. They kind of vanish, disappear. Demand for televisions weakens. That's not the real problem. That is a problem. That's the real problem. But the real problem is, as my colleagues have alluded to, is that everybody is now poorer. If you just do television, it's a very small effect. If you do it across the board, and I'll get to an example of an across-the-board effect that protectionists want, everybody is now poorer. So it's not just the jobs in the television sector that are going to go away, in part. It's jobs everywhere. Because the consumer demand to support the production that we're supposedly doing in the U.S. is going away. So unless you can do magic, unless you can make a magic trade where all these jobs relocate to the U.S. by magic, even though they left the U.S. for a very specific reason, as protectionists acknowledge, you're going to reduce consumer demand, reduce the demand for the very things you want to produce in the United States, and kill the jobs. And that's why we have fewer jobs when imports are lower instead of more jobs. So what's a classic example of this? The classic example, so if somebody says we put a tariff on televisions, television buyers are going to be upset, but the effect on the economy is going to be small. The best way to see that protectionists want to make us poorer and thus kill jobs is the currency manipulation argument. Because currency manipulation applies to everything. How do you get that currency is a bad idea? Currency manipulation is a bad thing that we need to retaliate against. You make false claims about it costing jobs. Again, those claims aren't based on data. We can go back and see when the dollar is stronger and when the dollar is weaker. And we find out we have more jobs when the dollar is stronger. But according to protectionists, that's terrible. And it hurts the economy. They can't find it in reality, so they make it up. What's going to happen if you actually put an across-the-board tariff or some other across-the-board retaliation against currency manipulation? You make the entire country poorer. Maybe only a little bit poorer, hopefully, but nonetheless poorer. Which means you get less consumer demand, which means you have less jobs. That's the tariff on televisions just affects televisions. The big protectionist dreams of across-the-board trade barriers impoverish the whole country and kill U.S. jobs. If you are going to make an argument against Trade Promotion Authority or Trans-Pacific Partnership or any trade deal, there are better and worse ways to make an argument. The argument that is wrong, that's dishonest, that's purely political, and is harmful to the country is the argument that more trade, more imports is going to cost American jobs. That is not true. There are other things you can say, but that is false. It's false when we think about how the world works. It's false when we look at the data. If you believe that imports cost jobs, you're a protectionist. And in my opinion, not if you have problems with certain elements of U.S. trade policy, if you believe that imports cost jobs. And that's just a sort of theological belief that's at the core of protectionism. It's not true in reality. It's a core belief. You can't mess with it. You are hostile to open commerce. And if you're hostile to open commerce, you're not a conservative on the economic ground, not socially and foreign policy, on economic conservative. And so when people like, and I'm going to use a name here and call someone out, I already did in print, so I can do it now. When people like Jeff Sessions say they're conservatives, and then they make claims that are purely protectionist claims, they're not an economic conservative. An economic conservative, as we just heard from Milton Friedman, as we saw before that from Adam Smith, as we think just using our own logic about what free choice means, can't believe that imports cost jobs. So that's where I'm going to close. I'm at the Heritage Foundation. If you're an economic conservative, you can't believe imports cost jobs.
Okay. Now it's time for your turn. Questions for the panel. We've got one right down here. Well, we'll start. Please wait for the microphone. And then if you could just tell us your name and your affiliation.
Milton Grenfell, American citizen. First, a theological point. To say that if you're opposed to free trade, you're opposed to freedom in some abstract sense, like in saying if you're truly for liberty, you're for people having liberty with your wife. I mean, that's nonsense. There are limits to liberty. There's limits to freedom. So that's the first point. Second point, he thinks he has history on his side. This 1950s analogy. First off, I wasn't around in the 1950s. They were selling lots of televisions. They were all made in America. We were not getting poorer as a nation. We gave away television and other electronics. We don't make electronics in America anymore, okay? Now, back to history. Alexander Hamilton put...
Is there going to be a question?
Well, first let's get facts straight, okay? Because you're arguing from a bunch of factoids that are simply demonstrably false, shall we say.
Isn't it true that in the 1950s, is that I can answer a question.
Answer what happened to okay. Well, if you can correct the record on televisions in the 1950s.
I will. Okay, that's good.
But no, let me get to the more important question. 200 years of history. Alexander Hamilton had a third world country on his hands, completely agricultural-driven exports, and he did something about it. despite you say in the Constitution something said you couldn't put export duties because we had them for 200 years, but we had a tariff policy that did grow American industry. And it worked. We abandoned after World War II. We've now become a third world country. Our major export is agriculture. Second is scrap. And nowhere do we have anything sophisticated we export. We basically have a third.
Planes,
Oh, excuse me.
semiconductors,
No, look
advanced
at
pharmaceuticals.
the chart in the Washington Post, the bar graphs. Look at what we were left with.
Every day.
Well, the big bar
I don't
graph
use
was.
the Washington Post.
Well, I don't dispute everything they say, most of it. But anyway, these are all facts taken from departments of commerce and whatnot. And the only thing we had anything an advantage or in the we were actually making money and selling in the black to China were agriculture, scrap, and transportation. Boeing. Okay. By the way, the last Boeing, most of it was made overseas. No, the trade figures are we don't make anything sophisticated. And so how do you explain Hamilton's policy not having worked? And go back to the TVs and explain to me how we were getting poor in the 50s and weren't selling TVs.
I'd love to. First of all, it's not 1777 anymore. Economies change. Apparently, you are having a difficult time grasping that. No. See, it's not 1777 anymore. Second, agriculture. That's true, and you're violating them. Agriculture is a high-value export for the United States. The average income of the American farmer is much higher than the average income of the average American. We are not Botswana, where farmers are poor. Again, try to adjust to reality. Agriculture is a high-value, high-value-added export for the U.S. It unfortunately doesn't create that many jobs, which is a political issue, but it's a very high-value-added export. On televisions, of course, in the 1950s, if the United States is the best producer of televisions, then the thing to do would be to buy American televisions. That changes over time, just as the U.S. economy has changed since 1776. Saying something was true in the 1950s, therefore should be true now, is idiotic. And I don't think you mean that. I think you're just hearkening for a period that can't exist anymore. If other countries learn, which is good for us, how to produce things which we want that are high quality and cheap price, that's what's happened since the 1950s. So the situation of we should produce TVs now like we produced in the 1950s doesn't make any sense. I don't mean to indict Terry in here, but he has a great example. Should we produce typewriters too? When we were producing typewriters and we were the best typewriter producer in the world and we used all of our own, should we go back to that date? No, because that's ridiculous. Well, one of us is.
Let me add one of the. I don't disagree with your statistics, but there's an additional statistic that doesn't typically show up in the trade numbers and how much we sell to China, and that is the dollar amount of Treasury bonds that the U.S. government sells to.
That's good.
No, not at all. My point is that if we didn't borrow if the federal government didn't spend so much and borrow so much through a trade deficit, and have to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars from China and other countries, instead of those dollars coming to the U.S. government, they'd be able to spend on U.S. agricultural products or manufacturing products. So one of the solutions would be for the U.S. to get our own house in order. And maybe instead of selling Treasury bonds, we should try and sell more aircraft and cars and agricultural products and other things.
May I just
Dan.
chime in? Just to add to what Brian said, getting investment from abroad is quite important, and if we've been running debtors, good. We're not a debt, but on account of foreign direct investment, equity investment. Yes, the government owes some money back, but the flip side of our current account deficit is the capital account surplus. So money is coming in. U.S. companies are being purchased. Foreigners are investing in our markets, and they're lending money to the government. That's the least efficient way to invest for them. But it creates economic activity and it creates jobs. So otherwise, we've run a trade deficit for 40 straight years. Why have we not totally atrophied? Why do we still have the largest manufacturing sector in the world by value added? We don't have as many workers. We had 19.4 million workers in 1979 in manufacturing. Today we have about 12.5 million, but we produce 22% of global value added. And China's right around the same. China surpassed us, and we've come back up because we're producing high-end stuff. We're producing the pharmaceuticals, the chemicals, business to business, the airplane parts. We don't produce things that you see on the retail store shelves, and quite frankly, that's a better state of affairs for us.
And if I could just, as probably the only person in the room who actually watched TV in the 1950s, if I could just say, a TV today and a TV in 1950 are completely different products.
Yep.
The TVs we could watch in 1950 had a screen maybe this size. They were black and white. They used a cathode ray tube to excite electrons on a screen. Now it's a completely different product. And the signal doesn't come in over the airwaves anymore. It comes in through a cable in your wall. So just to try to compare products over time like that is a difficult thing, I think, under any circumstances. Let's have another question right here.
So can I make a little bit of comment?
A little, but we
tell
would
us
like
who
a
you are?
question.
Yeah, actually, Caesar should know me. We met each other several times. I'm Di Dongshen from the University of China, and now visiting scholar at Georgetown University. Sorry for not visiting scholar before, visiting the office before. So actually, this is a very interesting topic, and as I'm from China, as China is always blamed by my American colleagues that you have stolen a lot of jobs from us. And China do enjoy the profit, a lot of the advantage from exporting globally, especially to the United States. It solves a lot of problems that the Communist Party faces in the past 3 decades. But I would like to remind my American colleagues to aware a new phenomenon, that this new leadership pays a lot of attention to import. In fact, I'm now recently writing a book about his mindset, political economic mindset. And to my surprise, he had made a public speech on the virtue of imports. He never made any speech on the virtue of export.
This is speaking about Xi?
Xi Jinping.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a quite interesting thing. And I did not see any of my Chinese colleagues have ever mentioned that. So which indicates a new tendency, maybe, that China is no longer an export-oriented economy in the coming decades. Actually, if you look at his policy, you will find that so far, even if the Chinese economy is dropping down quite dramatically in reality, he never made any public speech say that we should pay more attention, put more resources to support exporters. This is a new reality for China's side. Then come to the US side. So my short comment on what you have debated over. I aware that you mentioned the time of 1970s. What happened in 1970s? There's a very historical thing, is that closed down of the windows of the gold. Since then, you needn't, especially for the United States, you needn't pay for the real cost of all the products, of all the hard labors, or all the environmental costs from globe. Think about it. If I'm able to have the privilege to print a piece of money, say, in God we trust, or put Mao Zedong's photo on it, and pay you, and all your stuff, your assets, your products, your labor, your environment, belong to me, what kind of virtue it is? So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Comments?
I'll make a comment about China and more about Japan. Of course, we all familiar with the fact that we were told that in the 1980s, and it actually started in the 70s, that Japan was eating our lunch and Japan was going to pass us and so on. And what we got out of Japan is 20 years of stagnation. And the gap between the U.S. and Japan in both prosperity, size, whatever measure you want, has expanded over the last 20 years because what the Japanese did was become obsessed with exports, couldn't make the transition to a domestic consumption-led economy, and they failed. And now China is in a similar situation. We don't know what the outcome is going to be with China, but the disposable income in the United States per person is 13 times higher than it is in China. So the Chinese are, I guess, middle income, but they're way, way, way far away from high income. Their economy is slowing, and they're either going to make the same recognition that the Japanese made, which is, as the questioner said, that they're going to have to move off of the export obsession and try to create a functioning domestic consumption system, or they're going to stagnate just like Japan. And the U.S. system will again prove, if we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, to be the superior. So we had a Japanese obsession. That fell by the wayside because Japan failed, as it was obviously going to do. The Chinese, we don't know that they're going to fail, but one of the options is that, for them is to follow Japan's path, stagnate, and we will all look back on this period of China, taking over as laughable, just the way we look back on the 1980s, Japan taking over as laughable.
Another question?
having the last word.
You're not going to get it.
Okay, we'll give you one more.
Into the breach. Do you know the writings of Eamonn Fitzgerald? You should. He lived in Japan for 20 years. He's fluent in Japanese, married to a Japanese woman. The so-called, economic stagnation Japan has been in, it's only relative to what it was in the 50s and 60s. They're doing fine, thank you. They still have what, $1.5 trillion of our dollars. They have a very prosperous, very high-end economy. They actually, it's their government policy to sell that the Japan's in this sort of stagnation. They've had a real estate problem, which is due to speculation. All that had caused, and has caused problems to work through the system. But in fact, Japan's not hurting. We would do well to follow their lead. If the free trade notion works so well, then why are the countries that have done so stupendously well in Asia in the past half century, they've all followed essentially a mercantilist viewpoint, trade with what's good for you. Why have they done so well? I mean, it's worked. It worked for us. It's worked for Japan. It worked for China. It's worked for Korea. In other words, you trade for the good of the nation. And incidentally, Adam Smith was not for free trade. That's a great myth. He was for trade free when it's to the best. It's called the wealth of nations, not the wealth of traders or the corporatists or even consumers. It's the wealth of nations. And he says, when you destroy your capital base in trade, you don't do it. And I'm okay with getting bananas out of Latin America. We can't grow them in this country or whatever, I mean, that kind of stuff's out of the picture. Of course it's good to get those things. But I'm not talking agricultural products. I'm talking about making things. And when you've got, in Baltimore, 70% of its population was in industry in the 1970s. Now it's like 7%. I mean, it's extraordinary. You go to whole cities in this country, people standing on street corners. And those, by the way, you should be aware that your unemployment figures, they were doing this, doing that. You can't trust government unemployment figures. Unemployment's now close to 10 to 20%. It's not the 5% the government says. So they're fudged. But you just need to look out a train window. Look at what's happening in America. Look on the shelves of any place you go buy anything. And made in America is as rare as, made in Iceland.
Dan, you want to take this one maybe?
You cut me off there, Terry? Probably smart.
Focusing on jobs is one thing. I mean, do you want to stop the production of these kinds of devices?
I'm not talking about cutting off all foreign trade. I mean, let's not, don't go out ad nauseum.
No, but trade is an expression of our.
I'm all for trade.
Of our freedom. We should be able to trade. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, was about let every individual pursue his own self-interest, and in doing so, you expand the wealth of the nation that way. What you're suggesting is that we give decision-making to policymakers here in Washington who know nothing about economics and trade, but who are all too willing to limit our freedoms. So how do we manage that kind of a system? Who gets to decide which industries are protected and how we funnel investment to particular cities and manufacturing sectors? We should all decide ourselves by having the freedom to purchase from whomever, to transact with whomever. So you express an abiding faith in top-downism, which is something that's anathema to me.
Can I just a historical point short?
Yeah.
So one thing I'm trying to think about what's bringing your points together, and one of them was the U.S. used to do this, and certain countries of Asia have done this successfully. And in both cases, what we get is when you get to a certain income level, this doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work for Japan. I suppose it could work for Singapore, but Singapore's not a country, it's a city. What the U.S. was doing in the late 18th century does not work in the early 21st century. And one way to think about this is you rise on the basis of agricultural, private property rights in agriculture, freeing up people to then move into the cities and work in industry. But there are no rich countries whose growth is still led by industry. It's all led by services with contributions from high-end industry, which is exactly the American situation. Whereas countries that have risen up and have done relatively well, who still emphasize industry, get stuck. And the buying power of an American versus a Japanese person, this is buying power of an American, that gap has expanded over the past 20 years. And it's expanded because the Japanese are still stuck in the policies that caused them to do very well after World War II, but aren't going to work forever.
Yeah, I want to add one other point to this that hasn't really been touched on by any of our panelists, and that is that The trade debate in the United States, it's a mistake if you think of that as a debate between America and China or America and Japan. That's not what's really going on in this debate. This is a debate between two different groups of Americans. This is a debate between those who want the government to intervene to protect their jobs, protect their ability to charge high prices for their products, and American consumers who want the right to pay lower prices to get the best value by buying from anywhere around the world. So this is not about us versus them. This is about us versus us in these debates, and that's the essential dynamic of what happens in Congress and in this debate here in Washington. One last question here.
Jim Roberts, Heritage Foundation. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the numbers within these import figures about in a 21st century global supply chain world with intermediate goods trades and the amount of services that are built into some that are American provided services or engineering, financial services, distribution, marketing that are actually part of these import figures that are producing, that are actually contributing to U.S. jobs.
Well, I mean, we have the iPhone example, right? Yeah. So that's the one everybody knows, and it's the most grandiose one. But there are plenty of other examples. So
I wouldn't assume everybody knows that.
Okay, all right. So our biggest category of imports from China is consumer electronics, and some of that has nothing to do with the U.S. Some of it is Japanese TV production located in China, and then we buy the Japanese TVs. But the computer and the phone stuff is almost all U.S. chips. And it's U.S. branding, and it's U.S. advanced electronics that go then to Japan or Taiwan or Korea or several of these, then go to China for assembly. And so what happens in the trade figures is the Chinese get credit for the full value of the goods shipped back to the U.S. because we pay the price of the good, and it came from China, but their part of it is just the assembly part. Now, that creates a lot of jobs. They're not really good jobs. They're jobs where people are on factory floors, killing themselves and protesting because the value that they're capturing in that is small and it's divided up among all those workers. I'm not saying the American part of this is perfect. We get a large portion of the value, like 40% of the value of an iPhone, and it's divided up among a relatively small number of people. So the trade figures, one of the reasons you can show that the trade deficit is not correlated with job loss is because the trade figures themselves are messed up by this. We don't measure value added in trade, which would be a very different picture where the Chinese source of portion of our trade shrinks and our trade with Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, and so on rises because they're contributing to components that we buy. So, the lesson there is, and I know you know this, Jim. I'll just repeat it because Brian made me say things that I think everybody knows, but maybe they don't. Bilateral measures of trade are really misleading because you're not really getting a picture of your trade with that country. You want to look at aggregate trade because of the role of supply chains. That wasn't true 50 years ago, except for some part of U.S.-Europe trade. It is really true now. And that doesn't, that also means when the administration says, look, our trade deficit is improving with X country, that's also misleading. So it cuts all ways. Don't be fooled essentially by bilateral trade because trade is now multilateral. Even if it's one product you're looking at, it may be passing through 6 or 7 countries.
And just to emphasize one of your points, I mean, it's $150 to put together an iPhone, and that comes in the United States, $150 import. It exacerbates tensions about the bilateral trade deficit, which we should ignore. But then there's about 100% markup on that when it's sold, right? And so the money is either retained earnings, it goes into producing the next generation of products, that's services for the U.S. economy. It goes to pay, logistics providers and advertisers. And what's beautiful about that relationship is that, President Obama asked Steve Jobs before he died, can we bring these assembly jobs back to the United States? And Steve Jobs said no. Had they been here, the price point wouldn't have been $300 for an iPhone or an iPod. It would have been $600 or $700, in which case it would have been quite so ubiquitous, and then we wouldn't have had all these other industries, these accessory industries, and the apps, and all of these other industries that have been spawned by optimizing along this global supply chain. So that's the wave of the future.
And I think that's going to have to be the last word. Please join me in thanking our panel.